You're welcome.
Fabulous. So I know folks will probably still keep joining, but we're going to dive in because we have a lot of packed information to go through today, and we want to make sure to be able to cover it all. So again, welcome. We will be using the group chat for dialogue and opportunities for response and interactivity throughout the webinar. So please do keep your chat box open and feel free to type in responses, questions, and comments in the chat box. We also know that all the advocates who are on the line have a wealth of experience, and it's a great place to also share your information and resources as well. So again, thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar. I'm so excited to have you here and so excited for what we're going to be talking about today. We wanted to start by, again, just like mapping, because expertise is in us all. What are the expertise is that we hold around economic security and violence? And so we had a couple of key questions we'd love to ask. Just again, respond in the chat box, which is, what economic needs do you see for survivors? And also, what resources you bring with you into this work. So again, feel free to, in the chat box, just respond to what economic needs you see for survivors and what resources you bring into the work. Great, thank you. Yes, jobs that pay a living wage, building credit, which is fabulous. We're going to be talking about that today. Restoring credit, yes, housing, affordable childcare, affordable transportation, also crucial. Fabulous. Go ahead and feel free to keep typing in both economic needs as well as resources into the chat box, and I'm going to keep moving in terms of the context of why we here at the Women of Color Network do this work. So we want to make sure to honor the presence of historical oppressions, as well as the movement forward in terms of what we are catalyzing, which is equity and justice. And so we want to really situate that economic inequity is a result of the historical oppression, or as Susan Burton, at the executive director at A New Way of Life Reentry Project, states, quote, being poor and of color is a debt that keeps incurring interest. And Susan's words are so powerful because they really remind us that, again, that historical oppression, that white supremacy, and the legacy of settler colonialism, enslavement, exploitation of immigrant labor, all of these are the reasons that we have economic inequity in our communities, particularly for survivors of color and Indigenous survivors. And so we want to center that in our work. In addition, we also want to center our leadership. Or as Casual Vash says, if leadership has failed, we are the new leaders. And so each one of you who does this work takes on that leadership and enables that leadership. And we're so grateful for all your leadership in this work towards equity and justice. The mission of the Women of Color Network is to eliminate violence against all women and our communities by centralizing the voices and promoting the leadership of women of color across the sovereign nations, the United States, and U.S. territories. We do this in an intersectional approach, and we really recognize that we're not only talking about violence against women and intimate partner violence, but violence in women's lives and our communities. And so that includes everything from police brutality and overcriminalization and incarceration to human trafficking, to global contexts of colonialism, transphobia, ableism, imperialism, and all the other intersections of oppression and structural violence that our communities face. Our Economic Policy and Leadership Project really leads with the vision that despite the structural inequity and violence, our communities are resourceful and we deserve a place at every table. And also fundamentally that the inventive innovations we make in our culturally specific programs really have the power to transform lives, our communities, institutions, and society in general. And so we're really honored to build upon our actual brilliance and the ways in which we do this work for the benefit of all. One of the contexts we want to, again, center, why do we need an economic policy and leadership project? We need it because of pay inequity and wealth inequity. And so we see that there is not only pay inequity for women to men broadly, but also that women of color are paid less as well. And so that inequity is really important to mark. So we see that for Asian American women, it's 85 cents to the dollar. For African American women, it's 63 cents. For Native women, it's 58 cents. And for Hispanic, Latina, Latinx women, it's 54 cents. And so that is a huge discrepancy. And what we know is that that has a real impact in terms of what folks can afford, in terms of all the things that people have mentioned: housing, childcare, access to livable wages. All of that is influenced by this inequity in pay. We also want to recognize that if we actually were to achieve equity, we would have to wait. Black women would have to wait until 21, 24, and Latina women would have to wait until 2248 for equal pay. So we don't have that long to wait, and we need to mobilize and make sure that we are able to achieve equity for survivors and our communities. We also want to ensure that we recognize that these disparities are exacerbated across, again, intersecting oppressions, and so that lesbian women make less than men regardless of sexual orientation. So we see that same-sex couples, women in same-sex couples, have a median personal income of $38,000 compared to $47,000 for men in same-sex couples, and $48,000 for men in different sex couples. It also literally pays to be a man, in the sense that trans women make less after they transition. Their wages fall by nearly 1/3. And also women with disabilities experience a wage gap as well. So women with disabilities working full-time year-round are typically paid just 72 cents for every dollar men without disabilities are paid. And when compared to men with disabilities, this figure is 75 cents. So again, in terms of thinking about the work we do and recognizing that intimate partner violence does happen across communities, we still recognize that women of color and Indigenous women face repercussions particular to economic justice because of the context of economic disparity. Our partner, CSAJ, shows that the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice shows us that there is a link between poverty and domestic violence, as many of y'all know in your day-to-day work. We know that violence happens across all classes, across all communities, and we also know that not having access to resources makes one more vulnerable to violence, in the sense that you don't have access to options and access to ways moving forward. And so that is really critical in terms of thinking about the intersection of poverty and violence. We know also that abuse creates economic instability. So everything from income and job loss to decreased access to childcare to limiting one's transportation and housing, and that these effects are long-term. So they can really stall educational attainment and advancement, impair professional growth, damage credit and debt, which we'll talk about today, and also have profound health effects and costs, which again can exacerbate economic inequity and vulnerability. So this is the context that we do our work in, and we want to make sure to enable an environment where advocates can actually address the economic needs of survivors. And so we do that through this economic policy and leadership project by nurturing spaces for advocates to share information on economic security and gender-based violence. We do that with in-person convenings as well as webinars like the one today. We also want to increase the presence of women of color and Indigenous advocates doing policy work through leadership development and really center the need for policy advocacy in partnership with direct services, because we know that we need not only individual change and transformation, but also structural change and transformation for our communities. And within that vein, we really want to make sure to speak across movements and silos. And sometimes we know that our work in terms of gender-based violence often get siloed. And what we see is, of course, that our lives hold multiple realities. And so we need to be in conversation with folks working around economic justice. We need to be in conversation with folks working for queer liberation, and also in terms of racial justice and ability. And so all of those things are really relevant to the work that we do, and also in terms of our own lives. And so we see our liberation as shared, and that makes our work possible and more powerful. We have produced a number of policy reports, which you can find on our website. And so we've talked about everything from the need for policy advocacy to focusing on specific issues like tribal sexual assault, T&U visas, reentry populations, and survivors reentering communities, as well as over-incarceration of trans survivors and immigrant detention. So all of those fact sheets are on our website. And in addition, we really wanted to center what does economic justice mean for our communities? And this is what we've heard from advocates and survivors from our various convenings and in feedback to our work. When we asked folks to define what economic justice means for us, it included all of these things, not only access to affordable education, food, housing, and healthcare, including mental health and reproductive access, but also jobs and security, benefits, training, and living wages. It also includes resources and information to make the best decisions for our lives. And fundamentally, it includes larger issues, which folks may not necessarily see as part of economic justice, but we see as crucial to economic access and justice, which are sustainability, community, healing, and connection, and also being able to live with authenticity and dignity. So for us, economic justice means all of those things. And that is a great question. Somebody just asked if economic justice is possible in a racist capitalist patriarchy. And that is a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous question. And I would say that, yes, what we strive towards is dismantling all of those things in order for economic justice to be possible. And I'd love to hear what other folks in our webinar think in terms of that great question. Thank you for asking that. So I want to take this opportunity to move forward and introduce our first speaker and dive right into issues around reproductive justice. I'm so excited to have Fedger Saeed Ibrahim on, and Fedger has been a catalyst in terms of work around reproductive justice, and I know that she has some incredible information about the potential of advocacy as well as the ways in which reproductive justice as a broad vision can really empower survivors and empower us to be able to lean into full authenticity and dignity. So I will pass it over now to Fedger to get us started in terms of the intersection of reproductive justice and economic justice for survivors. And I think Fedger is probably just unmuting herself.
Can everyone hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kirby. My name is Fedger Saeed Ibrahim. I am a reproductive justice fellow through If One How, a national organization that mobilizes lawyers, law students, and other advocates around reproductive justice. So I'm here today to talk to you about connecting the dots in economic security, focusing specifically on reproductive justice and gender violence. And I'm going to be taking mainly a legislative approach in what I talk about, but towards the end, we'll be talking about broader advocacy work as well. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I work with two organizations under If One How. So the fellowship is through If One How, but my work is located in Washington State and Seattle specifically, working with two organizations. The first is Legal Voice. It's a progressive feminist nonprofit organization that does impact litigation around women's rights and LGBTQ rights in the 5 Pacific Northwest states. We do impact litigation, which means we don't do direct representation work. We only take on cases that structurally change the law. The second organization that I work with is Surge Reproductive Justice. so distinct from Show Up for reproductive justice or racial justice. And this is the only explicitly reproductive justice organization based out of Washington State. Our work is mostly community education, community mobilizing, and empowerment, taking a very intentional racial justice lens. Next slide, please. So I like to start with an RJ, a reproductive justice 101, just because we all come to this work from varying perspectives and we don't all have the same definition or idea of what reproductive justice means. And I'll be referring to that as RJ just for short. So important to lay out some history. So reproductive justice is a frame that was created by Black women activists for their communities specifically, and then later other women of color. And it was because the very traditional choice, quote unquote, choice framework failed to take into account the intersectional nature of their lives. And the civil rights and social justice movements often ignored sexual and reproductive health and rights concerns. So reproductive justice was distinct, but more holistic in their view than other frameworks at the time. Again, intersectionality is an important framework developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, also a woman of color. And it is intersectional in the sense that it takes into account that our realities are complex and your whole selves need to be taken into account in this work, as Kirby mentioned. So the definition that I like to use, I'll just go ahead and read this off the slide. The reproductive justice will exist when all people can exercise the rights and access the resources they need to thrive and to decide if, when, and how to create and sustain their families with dignity, free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. The two things that I want to point out here is that we don't have reproductive justice currently. It will exist, so it is this dynamic state that we are working towards. It is not this, stage that we've reached or will reach anytime soon. And also, access here is a word that gets thrown around often, but we really mean meaningful access. So coming from a legal perspective, it's not just having rights in the books, it's your ability to access those rights and realize them in your everyday life in a way that really matters. So a lot more that I can say there, but we can cover some of that in Q&A. Great. So I'm going to start with this last legislative session in Washington just because a lot was covered. Even though it was a quote unquote short session, so it's only 60 days, we have alternating sessions here in Washington. We had a change in Senate control, which means that Dems had all important seats essentially. They had Senate, they had the other House, and then they also had the governor's office. So we had high expectations for that limited time in terms of what we were able or what we were thinking we could pass. And we were building on our 2017 successes. So quite a few bills were not completely new, but were rollover bills from previous sessions. Next slide, please. Great. So I work, like I said earlier, with two organizations, Surge and Legal Voice. There's a fair bit of overlap in terms of what hat I'm wearing with what work I'm doing, but specifically here, a lot of the legislative work was through Legal Voice. We have a bunch of priorities, strategic priorities at Legal Voice. Ending gender-based violence is one of them, and that's a huge thing, right? So a lot of different kinds of work fall under this umbrella. With this last legislative session specifically, improving employment protections for survivors was a big one. So specifically, we passed a bill for employment protections for survivors that explicitly prohibits employers from discriminating against survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and also requires employers to grant reasonable safety accommodations requested by survivors. And this was the result of the fact that we heard a lot of stories of survivors once they disclosed to their employer their survivor status or the fact that they were in some way being harassed by someone who was creating harm. The employer would then turn around and use that status as grounds for firing, which is ridiculous, but happens all the time. And so in that way, the abuse continues. So we were able to pass a bill to specifically stop that kind of behavior, and to then also have safety accommodations that the employer has to provide for survivors. The second main line of work under ending gender-based violence was campus sexual assault. And just a heads up, I am going through these fairly quickly because we do have limited time, but again, feel free to ask any questions during Q&A. So campus sexual assault was another big area of work. So Title IX is a federal law that essentially is all about gender equity, creating climates of gender equity at schools. Under Obama, there were pretty robust guidelines for how to protect sort of due process and other substantial protections for all parties involved in, say, a sexual assault at a school. Once Trump came into office, we see that DeVos actually rescinded all the Obama-era guidelines and issued an interim Q&A that has fewer protections for survivors. It's a skewed process as it stands right now, or recommended process as it stands right now. For example, the right to appeal is accessible by potential respondents, but not the complainants. There are no real timelines set in place, and we already know that these timelines take far too long. They're far too long for survivors on college campuses. So we looked at a bill that would have codified Obama-era guidelines. So would have said whatever is going on the federal level, we are going to essentially put into state law what Obama had put into place. This bill, unfortunately, did not pass. And so we're looking at a second version of the bill that is more intentionally crafted to protect survivors for this upcoming session. Next slide, please. Thank you. So at Legal Voice, we don't do a whole bunch of work with immigrant populations just because it's not the niche that we occupy in Washington. We do work with immigrants when it comes to their survivor status. So one bill that we worked on was dealing with U visas for immigrant survivors. So the bill passed, and it essentially requires law enforcement and prosecution agencies to provide immigrant victims of certain crimes, like say domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, with the certification form they need to apply for immigration relief under the Federal Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. So we worked with a whole bunch of allies, including the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. And it was really their leadership on this legislation that helped it pass. That's important to think through again when we talk about intersectionality and reproductive justice work. What are the populations that are more often than not forgotten or completely ignored? Immigrants are a big one, especially in this current administration. So the U visa is, and we'll see how this moves on with, again, there are a lot of changes with the immigration landscape currently, but it was important to try to solidify what few areas of relief immigrants do have, and U visas is a big one. There were some other bills geared towards protecting the rights of gender-based violence survivors that unfortunately did not pass. I'm going to go through specifically 3 of them, and those are bills that we're going to revisit for this next session. But it's good to also go through, you know, maybe not so much the legislative wins, but the legislative losses or challenges, because even in a progressive state like Washington, not everyone is there, right? So it's important to think through what can we be doing better, and if not a bill, then how can we think creatively through strategies to get some of these wins? So one of the bills was eliminating statutes of limitations for sex crimes. There's a fair bit of controversy around statute of limitations. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. There is a fair bit of controversy around statute of limitations in general, around crimes, but specifically around sex crimes. The piece of legislation that we were looking at would have eliminated the statute of limitations for prosecuting most felony sex offenses in Washington. This did not pass. And we're convening actually a work group right now to think through some of those issues of how do we respect and honor the autonomy and the dignity of survivors, while also accessing the criminal justice system, which, as we know, is problematic in a number of ways. So this bill did not pass. We're looking at a second bill for this upcoming session. We don't have a lot of concrete details right now as to what it would look like, if it would be eliminating statute of limitations altogether or changing the timeframes. And I'd be really interested to hear some of your thoughts. But yeah, a lot of complicated issues there and a lot of nuance in thinking through into the criminal justice system and access to it. A second bill dealt with reforming Washington's third-degree rape law. So that piece of legislation would have eliminated a requirement that the survivor's non-consent must be, quote unquote, clearly expressed by the victim's words or conduct. I have a lot of feelings about this bill, but essentially there is a requirement that besides, essentially the survivor, the victim, here specifically the word victim is used, it needs to be clearly expressed. And as we know, reactions to assault vary. So this idea that it needs to be clearly expressed in some way in words or conduct is problematic and can further hinder the ability of a victim to access justice. So the legislation would have eliminated that requirement, and it unfortunately did not pass. And then a third bill is supporting survivors and bolstering efforts to end the backlog of untested rape kits. So there's a documentary that came out recently that I'm sure some folks on the webinar have already watched that dealt with rape kits and how many of them just stay untested. So among other things, this bill would have reauthorized the SAFE task force, task force that researches and recommends survivor-focused procedures and practices. The bill would have required law enforcement agencies to request testing of all backlogged kits, with few exceptions, and then it would have created a number of rights for survivors, including the right to receive forensic exams at no cost, to be informed of when the test will be completed, and then the results, as well as receiving prior notice to the destruction of a rape kit, which is critical. So this, unfortunately, again, did not pass, so we are looking at reintroduction this next session. Next slide, please. Great. So protecting reproductive freedom is another huge priority, again, especially in this administration. We were able to pass the Reproductive Parity Act. This is a piece of legislation that ensures that insurance companies provide birth control coverage without copays and requires private insurance companies that provide coverage for maternity care to also cover abortion care. It's a really solid bill that was 5 years in the works, and now that the Dems have more power, it was able to go through. I do want to point out, however, that it is by no means an ideal bill. It is only the first step in what needs to be a longer-term plan to strategically think through who is not included and how do we create laws that are inclusive and honor the needs of all populations. And alongside that, we introduced last session a Reproductive Health Access for All Act that was modeled after the REA Act, the Reproductive Health Equality, I believe, Access for All Act in Oregon. That was a piece of legislation that really intentionally thought through, again, besides, traditional choice, so traditional birth control, besides abortion, which actually has pretty robust coverage in Washington state, what other services aren't covered, and also what are the populations that aren't really explicitly mentioned. So thinking through our trans communities, thinking through our immigrant communities, and specifically undocumented folks, how do we center them in the work? Because as we know, when we center folks who are most marginalized, everyone benefits. So the Reproductive Health Access for All was aimed to expand reproductive health access to all people in Washington and included specific provisions, specific provisions that address the reproductive health care needs of Washington's immigrant and transgender communities. So that bill, unfortunately, did not pass, even though the Reproductive Parity Act did. So we are reintroducing that next session with some changes. We are in the middle of doing outreach with a whole bunch of communities and making sure that they're included in the process and that their stories are shared and centered in this entire campaign. So long way ahead, but it's really important to, again, be as inclusive as possible and to really not shy away from some of the challenges. One of the pushbacks that we got was, well, the fiscal note attached to the bill is very high, and do we have the money? And it is by far definitely the time to be thinking through how we talk about communities, and it's really problematic when we reduce, again, entire communities that have been abused and discriminated against and marginalized time and time again to mere fiscal notes that need to be ignored during something like legislative session. A lot more I can share there, but moving along, the second bill that we did pass was around, oh, we're still on the previous slide. Thank you. Was around supporting access to midwives and doulas for incarcerated women. So that is a bill that requires jails and the Department of Corrections to make reasonable accommodations for the provision of doula and midwifery services, excuse me, to incarcerated people who are pregnant or who have recently given birth. And I'm going to talk through the process with that bill later, but that did pass. So now there is access to services, which is wonderful. Moving along. Next slide, please. Excuse me, just take a sip of water there. Excuse me. Great. So supporting all families is also a legislative priority. We had quite a bill passed this last session around the UPA, the Uniform Parentage Act. So that piece of legislation updated Washington's Uniform Parentage Act and strengthened protections for LGBTQ. Excuse me, my throat's having a minute. I'm just going to sip some more water. Give me 1 second. So it strengthened protections for LGBTQ communities and non-biological parents, while also maintaining protections that were won last year to protect rape survivors who became pregnant and chose to give birth. So it creates a regulated system also to allow compensated surrogacy, which is huge. Washington is now officially the first state to have legalized compensated surrogacy. And it's been thinking through surrogacy again, which is a complicated issue. Really, we thought about how do we protect the health, financial well-being, and autonomy of women acting as surrogates. So a regulated system where they have a number of protections, robust protections was critical. I am so sorry. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to clear my throat. All right, folks. Thank you for bearing with me. Hopefully I'm better now. Okay. So alongside that, we also reformed the non-parental custody law in Washington and updated Washington's child support schedule, which hadn't been updated in a fair bit of time. All right, moving along. So as Perry was talking about earlier, economic justice is critical in thinking through any kind of work that aims to empower women of color. So advancing economic justice is also a key priority. We passed the Equal Pay Opportunity Act. This historic bill really is the first update to Washington's equal pay law since 1943. It fights the gender pay gap by requiring pay to be based on bona fide job-based criteria. So, for example, education, training, experience, instead of unfair assumptions and practices. And then it also gives workers the right to discuss and inquire about pay and compensation without retaliation. This is really important for a number of reasons, but as we know, transparency around pay is really important, and it is a key indicator in discrepancies in pay, how much they are, and then also your ability to address that with your employer and to ask for a raise. So it's a huge, huge thing that we were able to pass this last session. There's two other pieces that I want to talk about under advancing economic justice is non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, which have gotten a fair bit of publicity recently with all things #MeToo. So we passed a bill that would prohibit employers from requiring employees, excuse me, as a condition of employment to sign an NDA or another document that prevents the employee from disclosing sexual harassment or sexual assault in the workplace or at any other work-related events. Excuse me, take some more water. And then the bill also provides that any NDA or other document signed as a condition of employment that has, I am so sorry, excuse me for a second.
It's all good, Fedra. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just going to sip some more water there. My apologies, folks.
It's all good. This is all such amazing information, and I'm so so humbled to know about all the policy wins that y'all have made possible, even as there clearly is much more to be done for queer and trans and immigrant communities. And we see even as we get victories, how we need to keep centering our most marginalized folks in terms of making sure that that access is for everyone.
Thank you for that, Purvi. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me, folks. So yeah, non-disclosure agreements. So the bill would also provide that, or provided that, any NDA or other document that was signed as a condition of your employment and have the effect of preventing the employee from disclosing their sexual harassment or their sexual assault experience in the workplace or other events is against public policy and is void. And it also makes it an unfair practice under the Washington law against discrimination to then be discharged as an employee or be retaliated against for disclosing sexual assault or sexual harassment. So I know NDAs are, again, another point of controversy, but the way we see it is any kind of mandated silence is unacceptable. Now, if the survivor wants silence around that experience, that is completely understandable and needs to be honored, but any kind of mandated silence by an employer is unfair practice under law against discrimination. And then we also passed a bill for unemployment insurance for caregivers. As we know, things happen and you are pulled into a position of caregiving for an elder, for children, or other folks who are not, quote unquote, seen as a traditional part of the family. And so insurance around that is critical to make sure that families are supported. So moving along to the next slide, please. So ensuring access to healthcare is another key priority. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but we just, this last session in Washington, passed a bill that bans on attempts of so-called conversion therapy on minors. So the bill prohibits licensed health providers from attempting conversion therapy. And as we know, this dangerous practice, which purports to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, has been widely discredited by medical and mental health experts. So we were finally able to pass that bill, which is wonderful. Okay, moving on. So like I said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the journey for the prison doula and midwives bill. I'm also going to be talking about the gender marker rule, which recently passed in Washington state, making Washington one of only 2 states that have this rule, California being the second. So the doula and midwives bill, House Bill 2016, is a bill that essentially recognizes that all people, regardless of incarceration status, deserve to birth with dignity, respect, and support. And so incarcerated pregnant people and those who have recently given birth will soon have access to doula and midwife services. The bill actually went into effect the beginning of June, which is great. So it's been in effect for a little bit now, this summer. And its journey has actually been not what you would expect from something that gives incarcerated people more access to rights. So moving to the second slide, please. Second slide, Harvey, please. Thank you. So the birth attendants is a group of birth professionals based out of Washington that had reached out to Surge Reproductive Justice and indicated that there was interest in assembling a group of doulas, birth workers, to make sure that incarcerated people have access to services. They're actually the folks who reached out to Legal Voice when shackling was still a practice in Washington state, and that led to the lawsuit the Legal Voice filed and the eventual bill that was passed. So they've been very active in the state. The Prison Doula Project formed, again, out of them reaching out to folks. It was a group of doulas who got together, who were trying to think through expanding the list of services that incarcerated people can receive. That group fizzled for a bit, and that was primarily because they were able to access some facilities, but a number of the trans doulas or non-binary doulas were harassed by guards and thrown out. And as we all know, there's a fair bit of discretion around what guards or facilities can do and who they can allow access, even if you are or if you have been able to access in the past. So that group kind of fell apart. And then it was restarted as IMPACT, which stands for Empowering People Through Access to Transformative Healing. And the idea behind the rebranding and the resurgence of the group is really capacity building for folks who want to provide services in prisons, jails, and other incarceration facilities. So with House Bill 2016, it was actually a Republican legislator who reached out to a doula group, Open Arms, that works with surge reproductive justice here in Washington. It's a really funny story because it was that legislator's legislative aide who had watched a documentary on doula services and essentially really fell in love with the concept and wanted to make sure that that was a service that was accessible. So folks got together and rallied around the bill and recognized that it was a real opportunity to make sure that we would have a clear line into facilities to allow to provide a whole range of doula services. And for folks who don't know, again, doulas are birth workers who provide physical, spiritual, emotional support around the experience of pregnancy. But it's not only around actually delivering. Only around delivering, it can be, but it also can include abortion services and beyond. So even though we were able to pass the bill, and it was this really exciting opportunity, there are a fair bit of limitations around the bill specifically that I want to point out. First, it notes pregnant women, not pregnant people. This is not the most inclusive language. As we know, it leaves out our trans communities, and it's not necessarily inclusive of the fact that, again, not everyone who experiences pregnancy identifies as a woman. And so it limits the number of facilities that are accessible, which is something that we're working on. On top of that, we wanted to make sure that doulas would get doulas and midwives, because it was expanded to also include the midwifery community, which is great, and provided an opportunity for coalition building. We wanted to make sure that folks were compensated for their time, so that you weren't just volunteering on top of your job at various hours of the day and doing that only for volunteer time. And not that that's not rewarding, but again, it's really important to consider economic justice, that we compensate people for their effort, their energy, their talent. That was not something that we were able to include in this bill, but we are thinking through creatively how to either have a legislative fix or have Medicaid expansion for doula coverage, or other creative solutions to really make sure, again, that doulas who are generally underpaid and overworked, and midwives as well, again, get compensated and valued, financially at least. So, moving on to the next slide, please. Great, so now I'm going to be talking about gender marker rules. There's a fair bit I can say about this as background, but essentially gender markers are, on any travel document that you have or other important state document, it's the thing that notes that you are, generally speaking, most of the country M for male or F for female. I like to show this map just because there's a great deal of variety in the entire United States around gender marker rules. So I don't know if you can actually read the colors here and what they represent, but I can tell you. So the stars, as you can see in the state of Washington and the state of California, those are states that allow residents to identify as non-binary, male or female on their birth certificates. Only 2 states in the entire country. In Washington, only recently. The darker green, those are states that issue new birth certificates and do not require quote-unquote sex reassignment surgery or court orders in order to change gender markers. And then of note also is the orange. Those are states that require proof of quote-unquote sex reassignment surgery in order to change gender markers. So you have to undergo very invasive surgery in order to be able to change your gender marker. That's 20 states. And then the darker orange, that's around 4 states, if you can see. It's Idaho, Kansas, Ohio, and Tennessee. So those are states that do not allow for amending the gender marker on your birth certificate at all. Other states of note, so Alaska will include a mark on the birth certificate that gender marker was changed. So even if you go through surgery and all of that, your documents will still say that your gender marker now is not the one that you were born with and that some change has occurred. Important to think through again in terms of outing someone and the dangers that comes with. Mississippi, West Virginia have no explicit surgery requirements that will keep previous name to the dead name, and gender marker as marginal notations on your birth certificate, which is undermining to the change that you have gone through and the change that you want, and also is explicit outing, which makes it drastically more unsafe for you to have that noted on your documents. Texas also has no explicit surgery requirements, but Texan judges have a record of being adverse to issuing court orders. So just because you can doesn't mean you will, essentially, and there's still a fair bit of danger around the process itself. We can go to the next slide. So I like to show this map alongside the gender marker rule map, just because this is the 2016 presidential election map. We can draw a comparison between blue states with self-attestation models. So essentially you say your gender and you are essentially believed. And then red states that vary widely in terms of how they process gender marker changes. So Privy, we can actually go back and forth slowly, again, between the two maps. Yep. Yeah, so fair bit of overlap there, which is not surprising. Great, and then if we can go, yeah. So like I said, Washington's one of 2 states, the other being California with a gender marker rule. So California has a Gender Recognition Act. Essentially, the non-binary gender marker option is available on licenses. You do not have to have clinical treatment or court order required for the birth certificate correction. Someone who's under 18 years of age can petition a court to be able to make that change. And this is self-identification model only, again, so you are believed, you are taken at your word. There are no kind of invasive surgery requirements or anything like that. Moving along. And then in Washington, the Department of Health issued a new rule that allows a third gender, an X, essentially that's so you have M, F, and then X. That's an option now on Washington state birth certificates. What X means is this long list. So you can go ahead and read that on the slide, but it's not exclusively male or female, including but not limited to intersex, agender, androgynous, bigender, demigender, etc. So Washington is now officially the 2nd state to offer an official gender neutral option on birth certificates, again, second only to California. So Oregon, of note, it also provides a gender neutral option on driver's licenses. What's interesting about Washington's process is this actually wasn't a bill that passed or anything like that. It was a rule. So we worked with other state agencies and the Department of Health did as well to align the process and allow for a third sex option to be used. And the idea was to eliminate third-party approvals as much as possible. You still need to have a form completed for sex designation change. It needs to be signed in the presence of a notary public, and it's accessible by adults. That's great. So the journey really started out of court orders and requests that the department got, and then they initiated the process. So that's how Legal Voice and other advocates got involved. So the state really prompted the initiative. A coalition was formed, really making sure that, folks in the trans community and non-binary community were included and centered in this effort and that their voices were amplified. And then it was that coalition that conducted a survey to ensure that these populations' voices are heard and that their needs were really brought to the limelight when it came to this initiative. So some of what came up in the community survey was that X is actually under inclusive. So the list that you saw in the previous slide is long, but it is no way exhaustive. And then there was also some talk about, non-binary. What does non-binary mean? But even more so, like it came down to, is there a dash between non and binary, or is it one word? And really, this is the kind of nuance that you want to get out of community engagement, right? This shows that you're really listening to folks and making sure that you're not just looking for, okay, what's convenient to include or not include, but really, what is the ideal situation for the drafting of some law or rule that is supposed to be inclusive. So overall, this is a positive step. We're still on the previous slide, if that's okay. Overall, this is a really positive step. So adults will no longer need medical attestation to make a change request. And the rule itself expands the list of medical professionals who can attest to a minor's decision to change genders, which is great. There are a fair bit of limitations, however. X is still not a perfect option. So our position around X was that if you are going to define X, you don't include, female to male or male to female or transgender, just because these are already included in the terms male and female. So really going off of how do people want to identify and really honoring that. However, we did support the use of X as a third gender identity if we were constrained to a 3-option system. So if you only had, M, F, and X, then yes, X is better than nothing. There was some talk about changing X to non-binary, so having that as an option instead of X. And then we also thought about, well, what if we included non-specified in addition to X as an option? And then ideally, really, you would have a write-in option, right? So you would be able to say, I choose one of these, 2, 3 given choices, but I can also identify myself and use the terminology that most resonates with me. We got a fair bit of pushback with that in terms of, well, how do we track and all the databases we use, and record keeping is difficult. So a lot more I can share about that, but those were some of the things that we brought up. Also important to push back on the notary requirements. So there's a fee generally with, notaries, and that is a hindrance to people of low income or who don't have the resources to be able to access that. It's a bureaucratic hassle. It's harder for younger folks to have access to transportation to a notary or just access to notaries in general. And also really the requirement of a notary excludes incarcerated people. It's very unlikely that notaries are going to come to prison to sign your form. So we really wanted to remove that hindrance. The way we got around that is eliminating the fee. We're making sure that, eliminating the fee in the sense that there were resources available for folks who wanted to access the process but who did not have the funds. And then also training community members so that they could act as notaries. And that's really, again, thinking through beyond the rule or the law alone. How do we empower community members to creatively tackle whatever challenge they're facing? Other things that we wanted to get that we did not get is removing the parent or legal guardian signature, removing medical attestation, as it's costly, especially in lower income areas of Washington where folks haven't had a primary care doctor their entire lives. We wanted to allow X at birth for intersex infants, allow self-attestation for youth in general, possibly use X on all birth certificates until 18 years, allow foster parents or designees to approve the sex designation change in addition to just parents alone, so you'd have an alternative, and then allow an alternative process like judicial bypass when no parent or healthcare provider is available or willing to complete the application to change the designation. And then finally, and really importantly, ensuring that any change of gender designation is exempt from public disclosure so that the abuse is not then able to continue if you are going through some kind of sexual harassment or sexual assault or have someone creating harm in your life. I know we're running out of time, so just quickly, even in a progressive state, it's really important to think through a bunch of different things, but specifically when you're working on reproductive justice, how do you really center reproductive justice values in both practice and product? So product being, for me, coming from the legal perspective, really that final law or rule that you have, but also really the practice itself. So are you building coalition? Are you centering folks who are marginalized? And are you consistently asking yourself who is left out? This question, or this idea of nothing about us without us. Second, I would like to point out, as much as I can appreciate the law as a tool, there are some severe limits to what the law can accomplish. I like to remind folks that the law is about power. It's not about justice. You can litigate rights, but you can't litigate empathy. Really important to keep in mind. And then really also noting the different approaches to the work. So I talked a fair bit about litigation and community advocacy, legislation, community advocacy. Litigation is another big one. So really a whole host of strategies need to be employed, and there is no end-all be-all with any one approach. So thank you all for listening to me. I know I covered a lot. Sorry about all the coughing, and feel free to ask me any questions in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cedra, for all that great information. It's amazing to see how victories can happen, how we can make them possible, and also humbling to know all the work that is still before us. So thank you so much for that rich trove of information. It's great to see. And I'm so excited because we're not done. We now have Marilyn Salamanca and Tanya Ventura from Free From to speak to us about practical strategies for economic justice for survivors in terms of credit and building income. And so I'm really excited to pass over the information and webinar now to Marilyn and Tanya to be able to take this forward. So thank you both so much. Free From is an amazing organization working and centering economic justice. And so they're going to be able to really speak to some of these issues. So thank you so much for joining us. And Virginia, can you make sure to unmute Marilyn and Tanya?
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to the webinar. And also, thank you so much to Perby and the Women of Color Network for having us. So we're here to speak with you about income and credit building with survivors. My name is Merlin Salamanca, and actually our title is just very recently changed. I'm the Director of Financial Capacity Building Program.
And I'm Tanya Ventura, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Education.
Thank you. And so today we'll be providing you with an introduction to Free From. We'll be going over our approach, and then we'll be discussing income building, followed by credit building, and then we'll have time for questions. Next slide, please.
So Free From is a fairly new startup nonprofit based out of LA in California. And our mission actually just changed as well. So as a startup, we're constantly evolving and ensuring that we're meeting the needs of the folks that we are working with. So our mission now is to dismantle the nexus between gender-based violence and poverty so that survivors have the opportunity to live lives free from violence. So the way that we do that is, like Perby said, is by focusing on economic justice and helping survivors access economic justice. Next slide, please. And the way that we do that is through our three approaches. So the first that we'll be talking about is going to be the entrepreneurship program. The second is the compensation program. We won't speak too much on the compensation program today, but there will be a little bit of information on that in the next slides. And the credit program, which Merlin operates and directs. Next slide, please. So we're going to share a little bit of successes that we had in this last year. So Free From is only about 2 years old. We're going on our second year now. And we just piloted the entrepreneurship program last year. So out of that, 24 businesses launched. So these are 24 businesses launched by survivors themselves. And 100% made a profit within the first month, which is huge in the business world. And the reason why we were able to come to that 100% profit was because we really met survivors where they were at and listened to them when they said, that's not what I can do right now. That is what I can do right now, and really worked with them to help them build businesses that felt good and matched their needs. Next slide. So the compensation program, like I said, we won't be talking a little bit too much about this, but it's really exciting. And the way that this works is we have a free online self-assessment quiz that's available on this website, compensation-quiz@freefrom.org. Or if you just go to freefrom.org, you'll see the compensation tool. on our site. But what this is folks can sign on and answer a couple questions about what are their compensation needs, when the last incident of the abuse occurred, what kind of time commitment they're looking for, what kind of return they're looking for. And at the end, it will give them the options to compensation that they have, whether this is victims of crime funding, whether it's taking it to court, whether it's doing small claims court, and it gives them the steps as to what they need to do to follow that compensation pathway. Right now, it's only available in California, but we hope to expand nationwide, and we're currently working on expanding nationwide. So since every state has different laws and around compensation for survivors, legal compensation for survivors, it depends on the state and what is available to folks in that state. But just to give you a little sense of how needed this was, we launched it, and in the first 6 weeks, we had 60,000 users log in and use it. So it really speaks to the volume of this information isn't out there, and folks aren't really understanding, what are the legal compensation options out there for me now that I have endured violence. So next slide.
And our credit program is very new and just launched in January of this year. And so we've been focused on developing the program and beginning to work with clients. Currently, 56% of Free From clients are immigrants. And so we do plan on increasing access to financial services to improve financial stability and safety. We want to establish and improve credit scores to rebuild their lives and establish safety for themselves and their families. And then we also want to create credit building opportunities for survivors living in shelter. And additionally, we want to increase visibility for undocumented populations among financial institutions. Essentially, we want to make sure that survivors feel that they're able to be integrated in financial services and get their needs met. Next slide, please.
So this is just some engagement in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. What are some of the financial challenges your clients are currently facing? And these are some of the things that y'all might outline. So challenges survivors face when accessing wealth is they have an undocumented or an immigration status that doesn't allow them to work in the traditional sense. Access to culturally responsive healing. So not being able to heal, not because you don't want to, but because there's just nothing either linguistically available or that aligns with your cultural community practices. Lack of employment history, access to traditional employment. So a lot of survivors have gaps in their employment history or haven't been allowed to work or for whatever reason weren't able to access traditional employment. Lack of housing is huge, especially out here in LA. No access to credit can limit folks from getting a car, getting an apartment, or getting out of traditional affordable housing systems, which often perpetrate unhealthy relationships and unhealthy economic practices. Fear is a big one. Having no one to fall back on is huge. A lot of survivors feel like they have to flee their community or have to separate themselves from the community. So as you can imagine, getting a job without healthcare is very difficult. Getting access to economic resources or working on economic growth can be very difficult if you don't have anyone to kind of support you through that. They're either unbanked or underbanked, so cash funds are at risk. So what that means is that they either aren't used to bank systems or don't have access to bank systems or have a bank but haven't really used it and aren't familiar with it. They're at risk for higher interest rates and predatory loans. So predatory loans specifically target low-income communities, specifically communities of color, and women. So they're at higher risk for higher interest loans and predatory loans. Implications of using a fake social. So some folks are forced to use a fake social in order to survive, and that can lead to other issues. Some contract work requires credit, or some work requires credit checks. So this isn't necessarily always the case, but since a lot of survivors do experience credit fraud and economic abuse, a lot of them don't have good credit, and therefore it can hurt their chances of getting work. Next slide, please. So this is an example that I kind of wanted to start off with. This is one of our clients up in the Bay Area in California. Her business is called Marie Cleaning Services. So she is an undocumented single mom of 2. And for her, it was really, really important to build a business that allowed her to be a mother to her 2 young elementary school children, but also generate income for herself. So she was not eligible for a lot of public assistance. So it was just not, traditional employment was just not an option for her because of her documentation status. So she found herself kind of in this uncomfortable position where she wanted to support herself and her family, but wasn't eligible for a lot of different public assistance and wasn't able to work under the traditional employment route. So she started a business called Marie Cleaning Services with our support, and we helped her create her logo, her name. We helped her. Right now, she's currently getting all her licensing and permits that she needs to become a registered business in the Bay Area. And within the first 6 months, she made a profit of $16,000, which for her, in the 10 years that she's been in the US, she has never made that much money. And she was completely astonished that she was able to produce this income on her own and through her own talent and through her own ability to network and find customers that would work with her during the hours that her children were at school. So while her children are at school, she's out cleaning hotels, Airbnbs, people's private homes, offices. And when usually she's home by the time her children are home. So that for her has been crucial to her healing, but also to advancing her family in a way that's meaningful for her. For the first time ever, her and her family have planned a camping trip this summer, which was a huge deal for her because she's never been able to provide her children with vacation that she paid for herself outside of the marriage that she chose to leave. So this is just a brief little snapshot of the power of entrepreneurship and why for some folks entrepreneurship is the only route and why it's important to allow folks to explore this route and support it. Next slide. So economic abuse among women of color and undocumented populations. So we specifically, well, not specifically, but primarily work with women of color and undocumented populations through our programs. And the reason for that is because they are the ones who are more vulnerable in the economic abuse that occurs and in the systematic issues and oppression that occurs within our current economic platforms. So they experience a lot more fraud. Oftentimes, like I said, they either have to use a fake social. Some of them end up using a child's social security number, which then perpetrates economic abuse that becomes intergenerational just to survive. And that's not to bring shame on anybody, but it's just to help you all understand what sometimes these communities have to do in order to survive. They're also at higher risk for human trafficking, coercion of any sort when it comes to economic decisions. They're underpaid. So like Purdy started, Black women and Latinx women are among the highest underpaid workers. So they're underpaid, usually with no benefits. The wage gap is huge. They're forced to endure unhealthy work environments, especially folks who are undocumented and are maybe getting contracted under the table, quotes, or are not being hired in like traditional work. There's also economic dependency based on immigration status and petitions. So folks may feel like they have to stay with somebody because they petitioned for an immigration status together, or oftentimes abusers hold that against the person if they try to leave, or hold children against them if they try to leave. As I mentioned before, a lot of predatory loans and banks target women of color and undocumented populations and communities of color in general. These are loans that have extremely high interest rates and usually leave folks in these communities in more in debt than it actually helped them. So these are like those quick day loans, those like payday loans that you often see advertised all over these communities. Cultural implications around finances and healing. So who's allowed to heal? How does that look like? Who's allowed to talk about finances? Who's not? Who has power over finances? Who's not? Who does not? So a lot of those things impact the economic abuse that happens among women of color and undocumented populations. Next slide. So now we're going to go into what it looks like to build income. So next slide, please. So these are some of the types of businesses that we saw from our entrepreneurs. So cleaning services was one of the bigger ones. because it's in comparison to other businesses, it requires less startup capital, so that means less money that you have to put up front. It requires a lot less permits and licensing, so that's less attorney fees and less filing fees, and it just becomes a lot more manageable for folks who usually have children or who need to create income around different schedules. Landscaping services, similarly. Administrative services, some folks, we had them be interested in making jewelry, fashion. We had a lot of wellness and health and beauty businesses as well, which wasn't surprising because a lot of our entrepreneurs specifically wanted to start businesses that gave back to the communities or to the folks that they saw as supported them in their survivor journey. Hair services, nail services, estheticians, so those have asterisks, and food vendors and caterers have asterisks, and I'll come back to why that is. Caregivers, folks who make home goods, creative businesses, so that's any art-based businesses like graphic designers, artists, sculptors, anything like that, musicians, food vendors and caterers, bakeries, social enterprises. Social enterprises are businesses that not only are interested in generating profit, but are interested in also having a social mission or a social good. So like I mentioned, a lot of them wanted to create profit, but wanted to maybe donate 10% to a domestic violence shelter or some of their items to folks in need. So stuff like that are social enterprises. Tutors and web development. So going back to those businesses that have asterisks, the reason why those have asterisks is because a lot of these require specific permitting that you have to either have a social security number, or it requires a lot more startup capital. So food vendors and caterers require a lot of startup capital. And a lot of them, specifically like food carts and food trucks, depending on your state and your city, require ongoing permits. So in LA, they expire every 6 months, and every 6 months you have to pay a lot of money again. So it's very difficult to maintain those if you are starting from a place that you don't have a lot of cash just chilling, and then that you can use to pay all these permits and fees. Additionally, food vendors and caterers, especially here in LA, face a lot of are at risk for being arrested or detained or having their stuff confiscated, because technically, I mean, recently laws have been passed to protect them, but for a long time they were unprotected. And a lot of folks were doing this work because it is so expensive to get the permits and the space required to operate these businesses. Were doing it without it. So they were just doing it on the streets without the appropriate permits. And a lot of these folks were women of color, specifically Latinx women here in LA, and unfortunately were criminalized for making a living out of food vendors, being food vendors. So the take that we take on this is that if folks want to start this business, we are very, very upfront with them about how much capital it costs, but also respecting their desire if they choose to do it without the appropriate permits and the appropriate channels, and hoping that one day they generate enough income and save enough income to be able to legalize their food businesses. Hair services, nail estheticians, and nail services and estheticians, that usually requires you to go to beauty school. And a lot of beauty schools have a really hard time accepting folks who are undocumented and don't have documentation. And the reason for that is because they have to prove that a lot of the folks who graduated went on to get a job or start their own business. And there's this misconception that folks who are undocumented will not go into a job. Same for web development. So that's just something to keep in mind if folks are interested in these fields and are undocumented or don't have access to a lot of cash. Next slide, please. So these are some things that you need to know if you want to support clients or want to support folks who are interested in developing small businesses. It's important to understand that since survivors are pretty much building their own income, they are starting from their own trauma-informed practices and whatever schedule they need. So it's flexible and it works around their trauma. So a lot of folks that we work with chose to not go the traditional employment route because explaining all these doctor's appointments or explaining, why they're the only one who can go pick up their child from daycare can cause more trauma than good. So for them, it was really important to remove that and be able to start businesses around their healing process. Most business structures and contract work can be formed with an ITIN. So an ITIN number is for folks who do not have a social security number, and it's a taxpayer identification number. So most businesses, this is businesses only. So this is not traditional work. So this is folks who are building businesses. So most business licenses, most business permits can be filed under an ITIN. You just need to find an attorney who is used to filing stuff like that. You can open a bank account with an ITIN, and some commercial landlords accept an EIN, which is an employee identification number instead of a social security number. So this is commercial landlords only. So again, for like storefronts, restaurants, they can use an employee identification number instead of a social security number if the landlord accepts it. And startup capital can be more difficult to acquire. I think it's pretty well known that women do not have access to a lot of capital in this world, unfortunately, and traditional banking systems don't make it easier. But there are some ways that Free From and other community development corporations are starting to really find ways in which we can give women, specifically survivors, and folks of color more access to fair and needed access capital. Next slide, please. So these are some resources that you all can go to. So Free From, we have an entrepreneurship program here in Los Angeles County. We are no longer accepting folks for that, but we are also endeavoring in training other organizations who are interested in starting entrepreneurship programs. So if you're interested in learning more about how to access that technical assistance, please contact us and we'd be happy to chat. Mission Asset Fund is also a great resource, and Opportunity Fund. Those both offer some startup capital. So Opportunity Fund is for entrepreneurs who are a little more seasoned, and their focus is in providing access to capital for women entrepreneurs specifically who have been doing business for a little over 2 years. Mission Asset Fund does lending circles, which are loans from anywhere from $50 to about $1,000. Immigrant Rising, their website is actually down right now, but they have a bunch of startup guides for folks who are undocumented and want to start different types of businesses. So they're a great resource. Start Small, Think Big is in the West Coast and in the East Coast. They offer pro bono legal services for small businesses, as well as Betsetic. Betsetic is only here in LA. Next slide.
Thank you, Tanya. And so now we'll move on to credit building. I do realize that we're running short on time, and so I'll try to go quickly. And so what are some of the opportunities that credit and credit score can bring you? Feel free to join in on the chat. We can move on to the next slide. So opportunities that credit can afford individuals, oftentimes we think of things like housing, transportation. It can cover emergencies and access to capital, just as we just mentioned. Really, credit is something that everybody needs, and unfortunately, oftentimes survivors, especially particularly undocumented populations, oftentimes won't really have access to. Next slide, please. And so challenges that survivors face when building credit are, as we talked about earlier, that being unbanked, underbanked, cash funds tend to be at risk. A bank can offer protection, but if it's not accessible, then individuals don't have that protection. Struggle to cover an emergency or crisis without credit. They're at risk for higher interest rates and predatory loans. There are implications of using a fake social. So oftentimes, when individuals use fake socials, they might run the risk essentially of there's sort of some fraud implications around that. There's difficulty renting an apartment, as we mentioned earlier. There's difficulty buying a house or a car, accessing transportation. And then some contract work also requires a credit check. So it's not just the employment side. Oftentimes that for contract work, they'll also run a credit check. So individuals who may not have access to credit or have low credit oftentimes do struggle to obtain these opportunities. Next slide, please. And so just briefly, the way that it works in terms of us considering credit is that really that there's three major bureaus who are collecting information on pretty much everyone. There's Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And traditionally, this has been tracked using a social security number, which has made access to credit for undocumented individuals very difficult. But if we move on to the next slide, we'll see how the landscape is somewhat changing. So for example, there's starting to be opportunities through lending circles. Social lending circles, sometimes called cundinas, tandas, lotteries, many different words and many different cultures, provide 0% loans that have now there's starting to be some that actually do report out to credit bureaus using the social security number or the ITIN, as Tanya mentioned. So an example is Mission Asset Fund, which Tanya also mentioned. They are big lenders to undocumented communities. The social lending circles are really based on community. So for individuals who feel more comfortable in their community, who don't feel comfortable going to traditional financial services, organizations like Mission Asset Fund do provide that opportunity. And I just want to make sure that I note here that we particularly do not partner with Mission Asset Fund, but they are an incredible source. Next slide, please. Altera Home Loans is another opportunity where individuals may continue to build up the credit, particularly with a product that they call ITIN mortgages, which they provide in 14 states, including California. They do require 2 years of employment in the same or similar work, but it can be salaried or self-employed. So individuals don't necessarily have to feel that they have to go with traditional routes. 2 years of tax returns, again, using the ITIN. Buyers must be an owner-occupant with a minimum percent of 20% of down payment, and 3 mortgages paid off in full is sort of what the success that they've had so far. But 0 loans have default or been delinquent. So they're really providing opportunities for survivors, for undocumented populations, for individuals who don't have access to these resources traditionally. Next slide, please. And so we completely understand that this work is it can be very taxing, for lack of a better word. Right now, in terms of the credit program, we are building the credit program, so it really is meant to provide additional resources and continue to build access to that. But we also want to make sure that we talk about taking care of ourselves in the process. So talking about self-care and healing, understanding our own trauma, walking through your own past and learning from it, advocating for wages, benefits, and time off, building relationships with your team where these conversations are normalized, and seeking funding that prioritizes healing and investment in staff, and interconnectivity where we don't reinvent the wheel when we have to. We can really depend on each other.
So can I add something, Marlene?
Of course.
So the reason why we talk about this when it comes to economic justice is because a lot of times our own unhealed trauma as service providers leaks into the work that we're doing. And I think we all know that nonprofits and doing this work doesn't always pay well. So we are also struggling with economic justice and accessing it. So I think it's important to always bring that message home and understand that we should also always prioritize ourselves and ensure that our organization is also prioritizing economic justice for us as service providers, because if we're doing better, then we can serve our communities in way better mind space, healthier mind space, and in a more effective way.
Thank you all.
So thank you so much, and that was all we had.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Merlin. That was so amazing and so rich and full of information. I know folks have felt like that as well for both of our presenters. So, definitely everyone feel free to show your love to the chat box in terms of all the good information that we just got. And we also really welcome dialogue. We have still about 5 minutes to ask any questions that you might have, what struck you, what resonated. Also, what strategies, tools, or concepts you can take forward, or what strategies you bring, and again, any questions that you might have. So feel free to put any responses into the chat box while we have our presenters still on the line. And again, we also know that you each have strategies and tools that you use in your work with survivors. So feel free to share also the strategies and tools that you have. So thank you, everyone. And we'd love to hear also, too, what economic justice would look like for survivors. We started with a brilliant question in terms of, is economic justice possible in terms of the current racist capitalist structure that we live in? And so we also really wanted to be able to ask y'all, what would economic justice look like, and have that vision. So again, feel free to really respond in terms of the chat box. We wanted to, from the Women of Color Network, let you know that we will have our final in-person convening of this year, a national summit in September. It'll be September 26th to 28th in Baltimore, Maryland. We are still waiting for final OVW approval, but we are in the process of collecting registration, so please do reach out to me to get the registration information. And we have sessions and information related to healing our communities, to building economic power, and community-led responses for economic security. And you can see some of the amazing folks that we have already confirmed as speakers, folks who are leaders at worker centers, as well as folks who are looking to build transitional housing for queer youth. And so we have a lot of folks, and also folks who are able to talk about disaster relief and the context, particularly in Puerto Rico, and violence against women within that context. And so we're really excited to go into detail into these issues and also have robust conversations with all the folks who are gathered. You can find our webinar recordings as well as sign up for WSCN updates on our website. You can follow us at WSC Network and Corving Poets, and that's where you can continue to stay in touch. As Virginia mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and the PowerPoint will also be part of the recording on the webinar, and we'll send out a YouTube link for that afterwards. We wanted to end on really recognizing the amazing movements that are happening, including the Mama's Bailout movement, which Southerners on New Ground and other folks have really led, which is like the lending circle in terms of really having community action and really making sure that we're supporting folks who are simply being criminalized for poverty. And in that vein, really thinking about how we shift economic realities. As Kiyomi Fujikawa says, shifting the economic realities for trans people is essential and is a violence prevention strategy, and that our solutions aren't traditional. So recognizing that we do have brilliance and also that we need to change structures. So lastly, we really wanted to end on the idea of healing as interdependence and as liberation, and really evokes both what Fedra was talking about in terms of the ability to really affirm gender markers, affirm reproductive justice, access for all, and as well as what Tanya and Marilyn talked about in terms of our economic justice as advocates and how we need to center our healing and self-care as well in this work. And so within that vein, Noreen Hill has said, I use my culture to get back my healing and wellness. We are medicine for each other. And as Elle Hearn says, healing should center work on violence. We need to create opportunities for love. And so with all of that, I really wanted to again thank our presenters for the wealth of information, for your amazing advocacy at the intersections of violence. Thank you, Fedra. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Tanya, for all the work you do every day. Thank you to all of the folks who attended this webinar for the work you do every day, particularly in the context that we are currently in. We know that resources are dwindling. We know that more and more policies are being rooted against our communities, and we continue to persist. And as Damari, you said, we continue to change the scales individual by individual, and sometimes policy by policy and structure by structure. So again, none of that work is easy, and yet we continue to persist. So thank you all for making love possible in the world and for all your work towards economic justice. Here's our contact information. Please do stay in touch. You make our work possible. You are our support for the work, and you make the impact with survivors. So again, thank you for all the work you do in our communities. It's been a joy to have you all here. Feel free to let me know if you have any more questions. And again, we'll be in touch with the webinar recording and follow up with each of you all. We'd love to get your feedback on a survey. And again, thank you for all the work that you do in our communities. Be well, everyone.